so excited to be here today with production designer Mark Scruton. I am so excited to talk to you, sir. I am such a big fan of your work. I'm a bit of a Burton nerd myself, so I mean, your work on Beetlejuice is something that I've just been loving over the past few years. It's a real honor for you to be here today. Thanks for being here.
Oh, it's nice you invited me on. Thank you.
Well, before we get into Everything Wednesday season 2, which I'm sure probably feels like quite a while from now, not only were you nominated for your work on season 1, but you also won an Emmy, which was amazing. Congratulations. Now here we are again, and you are nominated for Outstanding Production Design for a Narrative Contemporary Program once again. So how do you feel? Tell me about this moment when you heard the good news.
It was pretty special, actually, because I'd kind of, winning one for season 1 was amazing for me, just because we had no idea what that show was going to turn into. So to sort of go from the time in Romania where no one knew what we were making and nobody cared, and it was, this show that nobody was interested in, to suddenly being this huge hit and winning the Emmy was a huge journey. And I kind of thought that was it. And, we'd done it, and everyone was going to kind of lose interest, and the interest was going to fall away. So, we put a lot of effort into season 2 to try and make it something bigger and better and more exciting, and all the things that you want to see in a second season, and for people to actually watch it and still give it the same kudos that we got the first time around, to the point of my peers nominating me, was really great, because I didn't expect that at all.
Well, I mean, from everyone watching, it's so obvious that you all really had to step it up and evolve in this season. It was so successful the first time around that where can we go from here?
Yeah.
And I think you guys definitely found it, and I'm sure you're finding it going further. So I have to be honest, you are the first production designer that I've gone to talk with officially. So I would love for you to set the stage for us a little bit. To me, production design is all about world building, and I think Wednesday is such a supreme example of that. So why is production design so integral to the storytelling aspect of filmmaking and television?
World building is a good summary, but I think world building, something like Wednesday, it's a broad stroke, but the reality is you've got to set every level of the environment. So, when I first get a script, you have to drill into it and find out what all the key points are, what all the, from the big ticket items, like, you've got a huge boarding school to design that somehow fits into the, the Addams Family universe and the Tim Burton universe and all those things that go with it. But then you've got to then drill into those specific characters and the individuals, and you go right down to the type of pen they use and the type of notebook they'll have, and being able to get a broad view and all that, and then at the same time leading the other departments in terms of special effects and in terms of lighting and all those other and just trying to bring those groups together to try and create that environment is a key role. And it's it's changing a lot at the moment in terms of my world. It used to be you draw some concept sketches and hand those over, and that was kind of set drawings and that kind of thing. But it really is an integral part now of making a show. Certainly, like Wednesday is something where it's sort of 8 hours of effectively a feature film. Where every detail is scrutinized and every part of it is sort of, agonized over. It's a big job, but it's a very rewarding one from my point of view.
And that big job creates like this really immersive universe that we all get to live in, all the actors get to live in. It just feels so very real. Like I'm ready to sign up for Nevermore. I don't know if I've aged out of it a little bit, but I would love to be there, and I think most people watching the show would as well. So let's dive into the second season. One thing that was major that I learned about, and maybe people watching might not think it's such a big deal, but you all had to relocate production for this season to Dublin. So, like I said, it might be so simple to people just watching casually on Netflix, but for you and your team especially, I have to imagine that was a little bit of a big deal because it served as a major reset for you.
Yeah, it was huge for us, and for lots of reasons. I mean, not least the fact that we'd sort of set up home a little bit in Romania. We had standing sets there. We had things there that we thought we may well be going back to. And actually, for all sorts of reasons that just wasn't going to work in the end, and we had to find a new home. And we looked at many different countries. We looked at various places that may or may not work for us. But in the end, Dublin, became our base. And that took a long time to solidify. I spent a long time driving around locations, scouting, trying to see if that was going to work for us. Because Romania gave the show a lot. The architecture, the look. I got a lot of inspiration when we were there. So it's kind of given our world a good steer in how it was, stylized. So to shift to Dublin, I had to make sure we weren't going to sort of stitch ourselves up and end up as somewhere which didn't have that world. We knew we always had to have America. That was one of the biggest problems, is actually finding America when you're not in America. But
Yeah, it's a little bit of a mind mind scramble there.
it's a mind scramble, especially when you get lured in by cool locations that then you realize that doesn't work. But there was enough, just on my first round of scouts, there was enough there to tell me that we could make it work. The landscape of Vermont is very similar. That we found there's some really great locations that continued that sort of eclectic Gothic sort of melange of styles. That was one thing that I was very keen to keep going, was the fact that Nevermore wasn't just a sort of generic Gothic building. It's this sort of mishmash of different styles, from everything from brutalism to Moorish design and everything in between. It was a proper eclectic crash rather than a standard sort of Gothic mansion. And we found that. So we landed in Dublin, and then we had to basically recreate a lot of the sets that we wanted to keep, and then reset on the ones we wanted to either develop or move on from or change. And we'd left ourselves in a good space. We'd burned down half the store at the end of season 1.
Right.
We found out that really Wednesday's Dawn had kind of been the linchpin. Everyone loved the principal's office with the giant fireplace. So we knew the bits we wanted to keep, which we had to recreate. So the principal's office was a location in Romania, so we had to rebuild that as a set.
Wow.
Minutiae detail, because again, as I said, these things that you can't escape anymore with the internet and everything else. Everything has to be, exactly right. Otherwise, people howl, foul, and say, hey, that's not the same place, or that's not the same room. So, and the same with Wednesday's Dawn. Wednesday's Dawn was quite a big set in Romania, and there was the only thing remaining was the window. So. Which we brought over. So the window is the same window. Everything else had to be rebuilt from the ground up, which is harder than you think, because it's not kind of a case of pulling out the drawings and rebuilding it. Because I think a lot of designers will say, as you're building, you adapt. You walk onto the set as it's being put up, and you go, actually, it would be better if that was 3 foot
Right.
bigger, and this detail's not working. Let's try something else. And yes, the plans, are your plans, but you always adapt and change and shift, and what ends up being built is never quite what's on paper. So you've got to remember that process.
Yeah.
So when you're rebuilding it identically, you have to remember exactly why you'd moved a wall 2 foot that way, and what the knock-on effect for that was. And of course, the other thing with that was we'd built the whole set in reclaimed timber in Romania, which we didn't have we had reclaimed timber, but obviously it all has a character. That was why we chose it. So we chose all the master beams because they had their own character. So we had to copy them, which seemed so annoying, I think, to have to do to sort of get these big photos of the beams with the splits, and we were literally cutting the splits back into the timber to get it to look the same. However, it did look the same, and it was important that it looked the same, because when Wednesday needed, Jenna and Emma walk onto the set, it felt like home to them. It didn't feel like we'd shifted halfway across Europe. It felt like they were back in their own environment, and that was kind of really important. And it was important to Tim as well. He loves real world environments and the comfort of what that brings to a production. So once we'd done that, then we had the job of designing the rest of the show.
Right. Which is, we're about to get into. That sounds crazy, but I mean, it's so funny though, the fact that it felt like home to them when they got there, and that's so important. Also, at the same time, you don't want to look like it changed somehow over their summer break,
Yeah.
like they were doing renovations or something in their
No,
bedroom.
we didn't want people to watch the show and go, oh, they've clearly moved. They've clearly, shifted.
Yeah.
And it was a big worry. It was a worry to me that people would watch it and go, well, didn't look the same.
Right. Well, it
Um,
felt seamless to me. I had no idea until
there
I
you go.
was
That's
preparing
perfect.
over.
The stress was worthwhile. Yeah.
Well, before we go any further, you were talking about style and Tim Burton, so I'd actually love to get a little insight into your collaborative process with Tim Burton. I mean, over the many years, we all know he's established a sort of visual language that, of course, does evolve, project to project. Um, so, I'm guessing though, production design is obviously very important to him. So I was hoping you could give a little insight into what that collaboration looks like.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, as you say, Tim's all about the design, um, and I obviously season one was a really great for us to get to know each other and to get to understand, for me to understand how he works and vice versa, and build that level of trust, which is vital. And then, as you say, we'd done Beetlejuice as well before season two,
Right.
so we had a good working relationship going. I grew up sort of binging on Tim's films.
Yeah.
So, so I had a pretty good, so already had a pretty good, mindset when I first started working him about what he liked and what he didn't like, and it was interesting because it actually, when you start working with him, you find it's not quite what you thought it was. Like I said it before. I think actually what surprised me was he's much more of a minimalist than you would think he was.
Mm.
Even though he's cute, credited with these sort of elaborate, I keep using the term gothic, but that's not the right term, but it's kind of a catch-all. But you know what I mean? That's his world building is renowned, and yet actually when you get into it with him, he's much more about a much more, pared back,
Yeah.
refined finish and a refined look to things. So once you get that in your head, then actually things are a lot easier to design for him. And he's very generous in the process. He will let you go away and come up with your ideas, and then you'll look at it together, and he'll tell you what's working and what isn't.
Mm-hmm.
And what I always find fascinating is no matter what we're designing, and obviously Wednesday particularly because it's the huge breadth of it, there's all sorts of things you're designing, not just the obvious. You're designing more mundane things and sort of more normal environments as well as the fantastical. But you'll go to Tim and you'll talk it through, and he'll tweak something, and he'll just change, sometimes small changes. He'll tell you, well, let's move that a little bit, and I don't like that bit, get rid of that, and then suddenly you have a Tim Burton set,
Yeah.
and it's most peculiar. It's like the little sprinkling of pixie dust over things that. And as I say, they're not the obvious ones. It's not like he suddenly draws a big spiral in the middle of something and there you go, it's Tim Burton. It's smaller changes, It's like he'll either adjust, and I sometimes try and preempt it, and I'll either overextend a doorway, or I'll give a little bit of a jog in a set, and he'll always go, yeah, make that a little bit bigger, make that a
Yeah.
little bit more, and then say, oh yeah, now it looks, yeah, and it's sometimes it's a very subtle influence, but it always, you always come away thinking, yes, that's a Tim set,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
fascinating to me. And it never fails to sort of amuse me that that's how it works.
I mean, that's amazing. I could listen to you talk about that collaboration all day long because, like you said, I've also grown up watching all these films, and they are quite minimalist. Thinking about films like, Mars Attacks and Edward Scissorhands, they do have a very minimal feel to them, despite what the common thought is.
Yeah, well, that's it. When you go back and revisit them, once I'd sort of understood that on season one, I know, I still, it's a bit of a bust and solid now, but you go back into his films anyway, just, they're either they're on or you fancy watching him or whatever, and you go, oh yeah, do you know what, actually, you can see it much more. This, it's all about simplicity of silhouettes, and it's about, the curve, or, the shapes or the shadows, rather than endless fiddly detail.
Right. It's not all just black and white spirals like
No,
it's the
well, no, no.
common
We
conception.
do those. We do those occasionally as well.
Yeah. They're still there, but it's more than
Yeah,
just
yeah,
that. Well, let's dive into the specifics of season 2 now. We have to talk about the Venetian Masquerade, the gala put on by Morticia. I mean, when I watched this episode, I couldn't believe it was real and just how practical it was. I mean, you even had a canal with running through the middle of it with a boat. I mean, so first I just have to start. I mean, was it really a boat? Was that practical? And talk to
Yes.
me just about the
Yeah.
scale of this episode.
It was huge, and we'd done the dance last season, and Miles and Al, the showrunners, came to me and said, we're going to do this Venetian gala. Go to town. I was like, great, okay. Um, and that's pretty, that's sort of, as a brief goes, that's kind of as good as it gets, really. Um, so th- there was there was a lot of practical problems with it because we didn't have, this is quite a long way into the season by this point, and the schedules on shows like this are just freight trains, and the turnaround of sets are, you're changing sets all the time, constantly opening new ones, trying to get rid of old ones, because it's just huge. Um, and I needed a lot of space, and you couldn't go anywhere to shoot this particularly. Nowhere really existed that worked. We found that out last time. When you can't take over somewhere of that scale for the amount of time you need and do everything you need to do to it. So we had on one of our big stages, we had this giant forest set that we've been using. A lot of the forest scenes have been done on a soundstage, right? Because you don't want to go out in the middle of the night with kids and all those sort of things. So we built the forest set. Um, and that was like, well, that had actually come to an end at a certain point. We knew we had an out for that. So I had a very specific window of time before, when the forest set had finished and the gala was going to start, which was about 4 weeks. And somehow we had to shoehorn in a gala in that 4 weeks. Um, so
Four
interest
weeks.
that was basically the starting point of my design process. It's like we've got to fill the stage in 4 weeks, and it's got to be amazing. But you've got, so you then that's your parameters. I knew I had to design stuff that we could build off-site and bring in. Quite often you build from the ground up when you're building something like that. But no, everything had to be built elsewhere. So that led me down the sort of the route of like theatre design and opera design, particularly, which big sort of grand operas of the sort of the 20s and 30s would often use big painted canvases to create very simple but very effective shapes, or very quick changes and all that sort of that world. Um, so I knew I wanted to create big shapes that were actually canvas frames that we would then scenic paint up, to give it a lot of this detail. And the idea that it was a gala was great for that, because you could say a lot of it had been brought in or was, scenery for the thing. So we designed these repeat patterns in these big arches, to sort of give us a big space very quickly. And then the rest of it, we dug into, and we came up with the idea that it was really all about fabric, so we could build these huge drapes and do it all with drapery and light, festoon lighting and all that world. um, but then of course I said, well, it's Venice, we need a canal.
Yeah.
we
I
must,
mean,
we
hey.
must have a canal. So then
Right.
we centered it around this canal piece, and with the bridge forming the entrance. So it was a sort of a process of what can we achieve in the time. What's important. Can we build a canal in the 4 weeks we've got on set, and in that respect, can everything else get built offset and be brought in? Um, and then you really got into the nitty gritty of what it actually wanted to be, and the color tones, and you know getting into the worlds of reds and blacks is not the cleverest of ideas when you really think about it, because actually they're quite difficult colors to work with en masse without it looking like some sort of 80s nightmare or something. um, we spent a lot of time getting the reds right and the choices of fabrics right, and we had to get huge volumes of it, because the drapes, the main drapes that sort of repeat down the length of the stage, were vast. Um, and I wanted it to be very much an eclectic feel. So not all the drapes are the same fabric. We have darker reds, lighter reds, some with more of a damask pattern in it. So it gives you more texture, so it doesn't just get boring. Um, and you it gives the space a bit of shape. And then getting all that set up, you find the right fabrics, but then they don't react very well to the camera. So we then had to cover a lot of those in sort of black voiles to give you a deeper red.
Yeah.
And then offset that with the greys and the blacks. There's a lot of grey in the floor to sort of lift that floor up and stop it disappearing into nothing. So a lot of time spent getting that color palette just right, so it didn't become just sort of a garish sort of mess. And that was before we started designing the gondolas, because you can't just pop out and buy some gondolas, and they had to be special effects. They all had to be rigged for special effects, and they had to be flat bottom, so because the actual canal was only like 6 inches deep. So there was a lot of moving parts in getting that right. And of course, the more people get into the set design, the more the writers saw opportunities, and the more Tim saw opportunities. So then what you thought was just a nice bit of background dressing suddenly becomes more prominent. So suddenly we had, Hester enters on the the
Which is
gondola
so incredible.
under the bridge. There's all those sort of things suddenly became huge deals. And we had to design the gondola in the end around Hester's dress, because Hester's dress was already well underway when we designed, when they came up with the idea of her coming in on the gondola and getting off. And she had these amazing sort of panniers, that were almost, huge, great things. So we had to sort of get very, very kindly ask costume to lend us the spare versions of those, so we could actually get somebody in the boat to get the right measurements, to get the right width of the boat for the panny, and also to make it in such a way that she'd get out, because it wasn't very easy for Joanna to sort of move in this thing. So the seat had the height of the seat had to be right to let her get out and step on. There was a lot to think about on that side.
That's amazing. I love how complicated this gondola is. But I mean, when you watch that scene, though, I mean, it's breathtaking, honestly. And I remember thinking in a moment, like, gosh, like this season was so good. I mean, I liked the first one, but I loved the second one. It was so much fun. Never forget that image. It's interesting. The next question, you brought up a couple things which kind of tie in what I was getting ready to ask you. One of the things I love about Wednesday is how intentional the use of color is, or the lack thereof. And I actually interviewed a costume designer, Colleen Atwood, a few weeks ago.
Oh, right.
And we talked about how Morticia this season embraced these rich crimson and scarlet tones this season. And it felt like that influence also extended beyond just her costumes and into the environments around her. So even something like Morticia's cottage, which was once Marilyn's very bright pink home, now feels completely transformed. Morticia got to put her own twist on it. So how did you approach using color across this season? And what was it like reimagining that cottage as an extension of Morticia herself?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. And it's great that you've already spoken to Colleen about it, because that she led that. She introduced the red into the costume. And it was like, well, that's great. That gives us a steer, because, other than Wednesday's environment, and I'll sort of come back to that in a minute, we don't really do sort of just black gothic. That's
Right.
not everyone, it's like we're saying about Tim being a minimalist. At face value, you'd say one thing, but actually when you dig into it, we're not really. So it's a great steer for her cottage, and by extension the gala, because it was her gala, and that's why it had that color theme to it.
Yeah.
But getting that red into the cottage was vital, really, because otherwise it would have been a hard set to get a shape on. But you're right, the pink set was far more fun in many ways. I mean, I think I've said this before, that it was a direct homage to the '60s TV show. That if you look at the original set photos from that show, they're all vivid pinks and vivid colors, but it was shot in black and white. So no one ever saw that. They always watched a black and white TV show, and it had this great gothic look to it. But the sets were actually got garish. They were, ghastly in many respects, in a good way. But so that was our homage. That we started off with the set, in these pinks, and the wallpaper was specially designed to be this vivid pink. And we went to sort of town on those sort of tasteless furniture and soft furnishings, and then it flips. So even like particularly the wallpaper was exactly the same design of wallpaper. We just changed all the color registers into the black and the red. And we actually had one under the other because we had a quick turnaround from when it was pink to when it was black and red. So the wallpaper peeled off and revealed the black and red version underneath. Which is, I like doing tricks like that. No one ever knows we do it, but it means you can turn a set round in a couple of days rather than a couple of weeks. And it's a fun thing. People go, the unit goes away and then come back and it's transformed.
Right.
We had to restain all the woods. I mean, one thing, we always try and do is especially when Wednesday's sort of leading that in terms of her styling, is the fact that we want to keep the original materials and colors and tones of the environment. So if there's wood, it's just not painted black. It's actually the wood with the very dark sort of oak stains over the top of it, and quite often we mix stains together to reveal the wood underneath it. So it's not just jet black. Or the fabrics. We start off with a fabric with a bit of color and a bit of pattern in it, and then we dye it into the grays and the blacks, so that it always has underlying sort of texture and color in it. So nothing's just blatantly just black and white. So that was a really fun set to do. That switch particularly was a great one for us. It was just a nice reveal as well when everyone came back, into that set, and it was like,
I mean, the transformation felt so, in ways like dramatic, but then also subtle, because you could still kind of see the bones of Marilyn's apartment on there too, which I love so much. But I prefer Morticia's take on it, quite honestly.
Well, no, me too. But we did. I'm trying to remember it all now. And as you say, it was a little while back we did it. But like when it's Marilyn's house, we have these big, tall bay windows, and they're square with sort of leading on them. But they have a bit of a gothic sort of glazing bar in them. And when we came back the second time, we actually filled in the top panels to make the windows sort of these tall and pointy windows as opposed to these square windows. There's all little details like that just change the shape without just making some big sort of gaudy statement.
Well, so we've had now the Masquerade and Morticia's cottage, but let's get into Willow Hill, which was such a fun location for our characters to explore. But from what I've read, Willow Hill is actually a location, so this makes it quite different to some of the other pieces that we've been talking about. How different is your process developing a location such as Willow Hill, where you kind of have these bones to work with compared to, say, the Masquerade, where you're building canals and gondolas?
No, I mean, that's a good question, because you have to, when you get the scripts and when you get your schedule, how long you've got to develop all these things, you just have to make a judgment call quite early on about what you're going to build and what you're going to try and find, or how you're going to play those cards, because you haven't got enough space or money to build everything.
Right.
You never do. You want to, because production wise they love to have everything on stage because it's much more convenient, but sometimes the scale, and you don't always going to get bogged down in studio sets. And Willow Hill just screamed to me that we wanted an environment that took us away from Nevermore and took us away. It was very much design-wise for me it's a reaction to Nevermore, because Nevermore is this very, eclectic sort of mishmash of styles and colors and characters, and it's very busy in our sense of the word. But I wanted, we had to take that and make a very spooky, scary space that was almost, pared back to the bones. And I spent a long time looking at buildings. I looked at real, psychiatric hospitals, and I looked at, abandoned government buildings and everything else. The place we ended up with was an abandoned seminary. But when you're looking for places to work into, you know the things you need to try and find, and you know what you can bring to it. So I needed a sense of symmetry, and I needed somewhere that I could assemble a gatehouse and an entranceway, because that was very specific to the show, and I wanted something that was a big, it was a reaction to the Nevermore Gates again.
Production designer Mark Scruton, thank you so much for being here. This has been such a joy. Like I said, I love your work, and I'm excited to see what's coming up next. It's going to be a lot of fun. So, and I hope you'll come back and talk to me about whatever new wacky things that Wednesday and crew finds themselves in next. The Costume House with Spencer Williams is a production of The Art of Costume. This episode was hosted, produced, and edited by Spencer Williams. To discover more conversations with the designers shaping film, television, and theater, visit theartofcostume.com or follow us on social media at The Art of Costume. And don't forget to connect with me on Instagram at HostSpencer. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to follow and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts or watch on YouTube. And stay tuned for more episodes celebrating the designers shaping today's most captivating films, television series, and stage plays.